we saw with the monological argument, that was an entirely abstract argument. Um, to get out the ontological argument from God, you don't have to do anything as far as observing what's going on in the world. Um, all you have to do is go from the standard concept of God. So it's a priori, prior to and independent of any experience, any observations about the world. But the design argument is based on observations about the world. And the word there, the Latin word to describe that is a posteriori, after and based on experience. Um, the ancient Greeks had a notion that actually set very well with the Judeo-Christian version of things. We saw that for Aristotle and even for Plato, there were built into the structure of the universe purposes for things. And very often for Aristotle, a thing was defined by its purpose. In other words, a knife is essentially an implement for cutting things, right? That's its purpose. That's what separates it from a chair or a table or a cup, right? Whereas, a cup is something that's designed essentially for holding liquids. A piece of chalk for writing on a blackboard, which we don't have here. So we saw in Aristotle's Ethics this notion of purpose displayed when he comes to ask whether we as human beings have an essential function or purpose. Because the Greek word that's translated virtue, arete, is basically tied to a thing's performing its essential function excellently. Now, and I probably said this before when we were talking about Aristotle. I mean, if we were trying to fix some chicken, right, and I turned to you and I said, look, I got to cut through this chicken bone here. I need a really virtuous knife. And this knife is not a virtuous knife. Hand me that one over there in the knife block. I mean, you look at me like I was from the moon, right? We don't talk about virtuous knives, but we do use the word good in a moral and a non-moral sense, right? We talk about somebody being a good person, a moral sense of goodness, but we also talk about something performing its function well. A good cup or a good knife or a good pen, right? And so this word arete was applied by the Greeks to even inanimate objects that perform their function excellently. So we saw for Aristotle, we're essentially reasoning beings, and for us to live an excellent life is for us to exercise our reason by investigating the world around us and developing theoretical virtues, but also by overcoming our lower natures and developing, Aristotle's version of moral virtues. So why go into that? I thought we were talking about the design argument. Well, in the early church, Plato had there was kind of a love-hate relationship Mixture of Plato's views and early Christianity gave Christianity two of its main first century heresies, ascetic and ascetic Gnosticism. And some of the Apostle Paul's letters are written to address that issue. But later philosophers like Augustine were influenced by Platonism. And we saw even Anselm was influenced by Platonic views. But the early church, maybe because, among other things, Aristotle didn't seem to believe in an afterlife, was not so enamored with Aristotle's works. And in fact, the works of Aristotle were lost to the Western world for about 1,000 years. And oddly enough, they were preserved in the Islamic world. And when the Crusaders in the Middle Ages went down to the lands we call the Holy Land, among other things, they rediscovered the works of Aristotle and sent them back to Europe, and it was the job of theologians like Aquinas to try to figure out, well, look, here's some pretty impressive stuff. How does that jive with our Christian beliefs? And so Aristotle is influencing Aquinas quite a bit in his view of the world, and it seeps into the design argument. Now, because Aquinas adopts this picture of nature as imbued with purposes and gives it a Christian twist. In other words, not only do things have purposes in natures, but they are purposes put there for things by God. Now, we could go into that in more detail, but the design argument has another name, a Greek name, from this word telos. We saw telos. It means a purpose or goal of something. It's called the teleological argument because the fact that things are thought to have purposes plays an essential role in it. Now, the thing is, after Newton and after Darwin, this view of nature as imbued with purposes basically is discarded by a lot of people. But the design argument gets underway from the observation that things in the world seem to have purposes. So Aquinas' 5 ways, let's put it this way, for most theologians, these arguments from natural theology are like icing on the cake. They're not the main basis of their faith, right? Aquinas' Summa Theologica, where his 5 ways are located, is a book that's about that thick. It's, 3 or 4 inches thick in translation. But the 5 ways take up only a few pages of that long book. But they've been looked upon as important by philosophers over the centuries. The first 3 ways are a version of an argument that I said, just for time purposes, we're not going to look at, which is the cosmological argument, the argument that God is needed as a necessary first cause of the cosmos, hence the word cosmological. Um, the fourth way, we're not going to worry about. But Aquinas' fifth way is a very early statement of the design argument. And basically, you'll see in this argument an emphasis on telos, on purposes. So Aquinas says the 5 ways are ways of trying to prove God from nature. And I mean, this accords with biblical claims that since God created the world, there are evidences of that in the natural world, right? So it isn't like this is something apart from the biblical version of things. So Aquinas says, look, there are some things in nature that do not have any intelligence or understanding, and yet they act toward an end or goal or purpose. So he says, if they lack intelligence, then they cannot direct themselves toward that end or goal. Now, what I have in the slides here, the illustration of an archer trying to hit a target, is actually the way Aquinas himself illustrates this. He says, look, an archer, no, let's back up. An arrow doesn't have any intelligence in itself. And so he says the arrow can't direct itself toward its goal, like toward hitting the bullseye of a target, by itself, because it doesn't have any intelligence to direct itself there. It has to be directed toward its goal by an external intelligence, in this case, the archer who shoots the arrow. And you can say, well, wait a second, don't we have guided missiles and smart bombs that can hit their target on their own? Well, if you think about it, that's not entirely the case, right? Because their software is programmed by an intelligence to enable them to have the capabilities of hitting a target, or they laser guide them from the ground toward a target, right? So you see what Aquinas is saying. If there are things that themselves have no intelligence and yet are directed toward a purpose or goal, then they need an external intelligence to direct them toward that purpose and goal. And so basically, this becomes an argument for God as that external intelligence. In other words, that God designs the world and builds in, as the external intelligence builds into things the purposes that they fulfill. And so he says, if these things in nature that don't have intelligence themselves, nonetheless work toward fulfilling ends or purposes, then an external intelligence was needed for nature. And who would that external intelligence be but God as, remember Aquinas, of course, is a Roman Catholic Christian theologian. God as God is described in biblical and church tradition, right? So this is a very early statement of the design argument. Now, let me, in your text is a version written in the 19th century in 1802, Paley. William Paley is a theologian, and he writes a book called Natural Theology. And unlike many primary works in philosophy, I mean, it's very unusual to see a picture or illustration. Okay, you get them in textbooks, like your textbook. But in the primary works, whether it's by Aristotle or Plato or Descartes or somebody else, most of them had no illustrations at all. Paley's natural theology is a little different because what he's trying to do is make the case that things in nature have purposes, that there are body parts of humans and animals and parts of things like plants that serve purposes and functions. And then he wants to take that and extend it to God. So your book has a version of Paley, but I have one here, and do I have the one that I think I have? No, I guess not. I thought I had one that was highlighted. I have to look, because I think I do. So anyway, now, this argument is called an argument from analogy. Now, arguments from analogy are always probable arguments. In other words, they're never ironclad deductive arguments like the ontological argument, or like arguments in mathematics, like the arguments in geometry. But what they say is, an argument from analogy says this. It goes from the assumption or the observation that two things are alike in certain respects. Thing A is like thing B in these respects, say 1, 2, and 3. And it says, look, just look around and observe that that's the case, that there are similarities between A and B. And those are the premises. And so what it says, what an argument from analogy does is say, okay, now it's obvious that these two things are alike in certain obvious ways. And then it tries to argue to the conclusion that based on those similarities, they are probably alike in a further way that is not so obvious. And that's what Paley does here. Now, a heath is like a field, right? But he's in Great Britain, right? So we're crossing a heath. This was quoted in the video, this first paragraph. But let's see. Trying to see if I can blow this up a little bit. So see what Paley says. He says, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. He says, I might possibly answer that for anything I knew the contrary, it had lain there forever, nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer, or that that answer is absurd. Right? I mean, think about, you're walking across campus, and we're trying to put more greenery than used to be here. Right? And you look down, and there are some twigs that have fallen from the trees. Maybe there's a pebble or two here and there, and some blades of grass, some seeds. And you look down, and there's no problem, right, in looking down and looking at those things and saying to yourself, well, you know what? These things are there, can be completely accounted for just by bringing in the natural processes of nature, right? That this twig is there is because it was a part of some tree and it fell. This grass grows naturally in nature, right? And that explains why they're... And rocks occur as part of the natural geology, right? But now suppose along with that, as happens, right, people either throw away pens that have stopped working on campus, or they're running around, they drop one out of their pocket. Suppose you find a ballpoint pen mixed in with the other stuff. You wouldn't say, well, isn't that surprising? Here in this little area, the forces of nature have not only worked together to bring about some twigs and some rocks and blades of grass here, but doggone it, spontaneously, the forces of nature have worked to bring about a ballpoint pen. You wouldn't conclude that, right? And so Paley goes on to make that kind of an observation, not about a ballpoint pen, but about a watch. He says, well, suppose alternatively I found a watch on the ground. He says, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. Paley says, I should hardly think of the answer which I had given before, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there, right? He said, just as you wouldn't have concluded that the forces of nature combined to produce a ballpoint pen laying on the campus somewhere. Paley's saying, look, if I found a pocket watch there, which is the kind of watch that would have been around, say, in 1802, he says, I wouldn't have given the same answer that I gave for the stone that, for all I knew, might have been there forever and just produced by the forces of nature. But now Paley goes on and he says, well, why would my answer be different? He says, yet why should not this answer, that is, that the watch might have just been there forever and produced by the force of nature, why would not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Now here's where we get into purposes, right? He says, why is it not, this answer not as admissible in the second case as in the first? And he says, for this reason and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. That is, now, here's one thing you got to develop your skills at, especially now that you're in college and your reading assignments are longer. And this is what they test on national tests like the law SAT and the MCAT, the medical school exam. You know, can you read and can you pick out the main points made and separate out the main points from not as important supporting material? So here, the main point is that there's a difference between the watch and the stone, and it's that the watch has parts that were meticulously formed together to enable it to fulfill a particular purpose or function. Now, Paley goes in to more detail than you and I would ever want to know about the workings of an old spring type and wheel tick-tock pocket watch, right? But he's basically trying to make one point, and that is what? That it's put together in a very meticulous way to enable the hands to move in a way that enables the watch to function as a timepiece, that makes it useful for the purpose of telling time, right? So now, the one thing I do in my selection, now I'm going to skip over some stuff in between where Paley tries to do something that we looked at when we looked at how to write. Sometimes you can anticipate objections, and you can read over this because it's also in your selection. Paley anticipates some objections. He says it wouldn't weaken this conclusion. So what he says is basically that the watch needed a designer to enable it to fulfill this function. Says the inference we think is inevitable, where I'm pointing, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers, in other words, a craftsperson who formed it, who designed and made the watch for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who understood its construction, designed its use, right? So there is one part of the analogy, right? Now, he says various things would not weaken this conclusion that the watch needed a designer. But here's what I do, and your author should have put this in, because this is where Paley drives the analogy home. Paley, as I said, in his natural theology, makes the same point over and over again, that there are various things in nature that have parts that function to produce, to enable them to fulfill certain purposes. But Paley is particularly enamored with the human eye. So he says, look, here's the human eye, and it has many of the properties that a man-made product like a watch has. He says, were there no example in the world of contrivance, contrivance is another word for design, of design except that of the eye, it would be alone sufficient to support the conclusion which we draw from it as to the necessity of an intelligent creator. Now, is that when you see creator, is there a typo there? I mean, folks, put your phones away. We only have 10 minutes. I appreciate your It's not a typo, right? If creator is capitalized, we're talking about God as their creator, right? Just like you capitalize in monotheism the word God, capital G. Creator means an intelligent designer, namely God. So here's the analogy, right? Paley says, look, a man-made product like a watch is different from a stone in that it has intricate parts that work together to enable it to fulfill a particular purpose. And the watch needed a designer to make it function that way. An intelligence, an external intelligence that designed it. It didn't just occur. And so Paley says, but look, there are things in nature like the human eye that are similar to the watch in that they also have parts intricately formed together to enable that thing like the eye to fulfill a purpose or function, namely enabling us to see. So there's the analogy. Observe that there are similarities between the eye and a man-made product like the watch. Now, how do we get to the non-obvious conclusion? Paley says, well, look, a man-made item like a watch or a pen needed an external intelligence to design it so that those parts, like the parts of this thing, intricately work together to enable it to fulfill its purpose. So, why wouldn't a part of an animal or plant, like the eye, that also has parts that intricately work together to enable it to fulfill a purpose, why wouldn't that also need an external intelligence to design it to fulfill that purpose? And of course, for Paley, who else would the designer of nature be? He's a Protestant theologian, but God himself. So there's how the argument from analogy works, the design argument. Now, I'll probably review some of this, but we, have gotten some more people in. So remember, we have no class next week, and your assignment is to have a great spring break and a safe one.